Hey guys, tonight we step into the high, thin air of a windswept plateau, where the grass ripples like a green ocean under a restless sky. Before you stands a slab of stone so massive and unmoving it makes you feel like a small bird perched on the shoulder of time itself. The wind whips around your ears in an endless whistle, carrying the scent of rain from mountains you can't see. You probably won't survive this. At least not if you're hoping to outstare the rock into giving up its secrets. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when you're listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your boots crunch into the brittle turf as you walk toward the lone stone rising ahead. There's no crowd, no fences, no souvenir stands. Just you, the wind, and this silent sentinel. The surface catches shifting light from the sun ducking in and out of clouds, revealing shades of gray streaked with faint bands of reddish mineral. Fact: megaliths, massive stones placed by human or unknown hands, are found on every inhabited continent, often in places where the technology to move such objects seems improbable for the era. This one, according to mainstream archaeologists, doesn't even fit neatly into any known cultural timeline. As you draw nearer, a quirky detail jumps out. At a certain angle, the top ridge of the stone looks eerily like the profile of a reclining figure, chin, lips, and a hint of a forehead. Historians still argue whether this is an intentional carving or just the geological equivalent of a happy accident. The air here is crisp but thin, and each breath feels like sipping from a straw. The plateau's edge drops steeply to mist-filled valleys, giving the sense that the world below belongs to another age entirely. Your hand goes instinctively to your phone, thinking about snapping a picture. But you hesitate, as though the act might somehow lessen the stone's quiet authority. A shadow of a hawk passes over, and for a moment it seems the bird has circled here countless times, perhaps for generations, perhaps longer than anyone remembers. You can almost imagine it watching the first person to stand where you are now, thousands or tens of thousands of years ago. A sudden gust presses your coat tight against your back, and you lean forward, feeling the cold bite through the seams. Jokingly, you think, great, a prehistoric wind tunnel, exactly what I needed today. But part of you relishes it, as if the place is testing you, sizing you up before letting you any closer. The stone stands apart, yet somehow it belongs here more than the grass, more than the sky. You take another step forward, the wind roaring briefly in your ears like the rush of distant surf, and realize you've crossed into its shadow. The shadow feels cooler than the air just beyond it, as if the stone holds on to the chill of 1,000 winters. You step closer until your gloved hand rests against the weathered surface. The texture surprises you, neither the coarse, flaking grit you expect from exposed rock nor the smooth polish of worked stone. Instead, it's something in between, a stubborn blend of nature and craft. You run your fingers along shallow grooves that travel in looping arcs. Some are wide enough to slip a fingertip into, others no more than hairline scratches that catch the light just so. They seem to begin and end in no obvious pattern, like sentences in a language you've never seen. Fact: many ancient megaliths around the world bear tool marks suggesting they were worked by human hands, chisels, pounding stones, or polishing techniques. But here, no one agrees. The grooves could be the product of long-forgotten tools or the result of millennia of wind and rain gnawing at the same stubborn spots. A quirky possibility pops into your head. Maybe these marks are prehistoric graffiti. Someone's very old, very permanent "I was here." You picture an Ice Age teenager carving their initials with all the seriousness of a Nobel Prize speech. Historians still argue whether the earliest human engravings were functional messages or pure artistic expression. You lean your forehead against the stone for a moment, feeling the sun-warmed patches between cooler streaks. The wind's howl muffles here, replaced by the low hum of the plateau's emptiness. The scent of crushed grass rises at your feet, fresh and sharp. Looking up, you notice that the stone's surface changes subtly in color from base to top, the gray giving way to a warmer, almost honeyed shade. If this were a building, you'd suspect it had been assembled from blocks of different origins. But this is one solid mass, rooted deep. Your boots scuff the ground, and a few pebbles tumble toward a shallow hollow at the base. You crouch, peering into the depression. Inside, wind-blown leaves, bits of bone too small to identify, and a few odd pebbles of a darker mineral lie collected. It feels like a pocket of time that no one has disturbed in years. You trace another groove, and your mind wanders to the possibility that these lines once held something. Metal inlays, colored pigments, perhaps even plant fibers braided in symbolic knots. The thought feels absurd until you recall that ancient cultures often combined stone with perishable materials now long vanished. A cloud drifts over the sun, casting the stone in a uniform gray that seems to deepen its silence. You step back, shaking your head. "All right," you mutter under your breath. You win round one. The stone naturally says nothing. You wander back toward the narrow trail where the locals wait, their silhouettes framed by the windswept grass. A small group has gathered, wrapped in woven cloaks dyed with earthy reds and deep blues. Their faces are sun-lined, their eyes carrying the calm of people who have lived in the shadow of this stone all their lives. An older man steps forward, leaning on a carved walking stick polished smooth by decades of use. His voice is low but steady, carrying over the wind as he begins to speak in the local dialect. A younger woman translates for you, her tone warm and deliberate. He tells of a time before the mountains had names, when the sky was closer and the earth softer. The stone, he says, was placed here by Los Gigantes. Being so tall, their heads brushed the clouds. They came not to rule, but to teach. The grooves on the stone, he explains, are not cracks or tool marks, but a script that only the giants could read. They wrote of storms to come, of rivers that would change course, and of stars that would one day fall. Fact, many ancient monuments have legends tying them to giants, whether it's the biblical Nephilim, the titans of Greek myth, or the enormous builders of Andean folklore. While historians treat these stories as metaphor or cultural memory, the consistency of the theme is striking across continents. Then comes a quirkier tale from one of the younger men, who claims his grandfather once swore he saw light flicker from the grooves during a lightning storm. Some villagers believe the megalith drinks in thunder, holding its power in silence until it chooses to release it. Historians still argue whether such lightning-related myths grew from natural phenomena or the human urge to assign meaning to the unexplainable. You glance at the old man's eyes as he speaks. They're not pleading for you to believe, nor are they mocking your skepticism. They simply deliver the story as if it were the weather. Sometimes the sky rains. Sometimes it holds giants. A child in the group tugs at your sleeve, pointing toward a smaller rock half buried in the grass. The woman translating explains that the children here call it the baby, as if the great stone might one day grow another in its likeness. You almost laugh, but the idea isn't much stranger than anything you've heard so far. As the wind sharpens, the group begins to disperse, drifting back toward the village. The old man stays a moment longer, tapping the base of the megalith with his stick as if in farewell. Then he turns, his cloak flaring slightly in the gusts, and leaves you alone once more with the stone's silent bulk. The plateau feels different now, not emptier but layered, as if the ground remembers every whispered tale and chooses to keep them here, humming beneath your feet. You begin to pace along the megalith's base, each step crunching over grit and tufts of stubborn grass. At first glance, it's just a wall of stone, but the longer you measure it with your stride, the more absurd its scale becomes. You count your paces, lose track, start again, and still the far corner refuses to arrive. It towers above you like the hull of a ship frozen mid-voyage, its edges too straight in some places and oddly organic in others. The human brain likes things that fit neatly into boxes, but this stone plays by its own rules. You picture ancient builders standing here with ropes and pulleys, then quickly dismiss the image. Even imagining 1,000 of them all working in perfect unison doesn't explain how they would lift, place, and align something this massive without cranes, engines, or at least a really generous physics loophole. A well-documented fact from modern archaeology. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 4,500 years ago, contains individual stones weighing up to 80 tons. This megalith, though, is rumored to dwarf that, possibly tipping the scale at several hundred tons. If true, it would make even Egypt's finest achievements seem modest by comparison. Halfway along the base, you spot a peculiar indentation, a narrow recess shaped almost like a doorway, except it leads nowhere. Its surface is smoother than the surrounding stone, as if it's been touched more often or shielded from the weather. One fringe theory claims such recesses were not functional doorways but frequency gates, meant to channel sound or energy from one side of the stone to the other. Historians still argue whether these ideas have any grounding in reality, or if they belong in the comfortable drawer labeled creative speculation. A gust of wind rushes along the wall's length, and for a moment it feels like the stone is breathing, inhaling on one side, exhaling on the other. You try not to read too much into it, but your inner voice mutters, "That's not how rocks usually behave." By the time you reach the far end, the late afternoon sun has shifted enough to cast a long, sharp shadow across the plateau. You turn to look back along the megalith's flank, and the sight of its uninterrupted length stirs something between awe and mild existential crisis. If it predates all known civilizations, then who exactly stood here first, pacing like you are now? Your modern shoes leave shallow prints in the dirt. Somewhere beneath, perhaps buried deep, might be the footprints of those unknown builders, unless the wind has long since erased every trace. Either way, the scale of the task they completed leaves you standing still for a moment, tiny and very aware of it. You kneel where shadow cools the stone and let your eyes learn its surface the slow way, thumb by thumb, ridge by ridge. The closer you look, the less natural it feels. Not because nature can't do wonders, but because nature is messy in a different rhythm. Here, the roughness is organized. The pits and striations resolve into families, peck marks that advance in tidy lanes, longer, slightly arced sweeps that read like brushstrokes, faint parallel scratches that keep the same spacing for handspan after handspan. You tilt your head. That spacing is the sort of thing a tool imposes, human hands insisting on intervals even when the wind isn't watching. A mainstream anchor steadies your curiosity. Across the ancient world, large stones were shaped with simple kits. Hammerstones for pecking, harder pounders for bruising, chisels and abrasives for dressing, sand and water for polishing. Archaeological finds from quarries in Egypt, Peru, and the Levant show that with patience you can grind granite and andesite into obedience without steel or diamond. The recipe is time plus stamina plus a foreman who believes in both. You run your fingers over a zone where pecking marks overlap in tidy scalloped rows. You can almost hear the rhythm. Tap, tap, reset, tap, tap, reset. It's hypnotic, like a metronome with calluses. A little farther along, a different signature appears. The stone holds a shallow curving groove that keeps a constant width, narrower than your thumb, wider than a thread. You trace it and feel faint corrugations along the floor of the cut, as if a gritty cord sawed back and forth while someone fed it sand. The curvature isn't a perfect arc, it flares and tightens the way a person's hand trembles slightly when they're trying to cut a clean line in a stubborn material. You try not to take it personally that a 10,000-pound problem might have better fine motor skills than you before coffee. Next, an oval depression, neat, dish-like, too regular to be a random flake. Its rim carries tiny ridges where blow after blow overlapped, like the scales of a fish frozen mid-swim. The center is smoother, almost polished. You picture a crew rotating through in shifts. One pecks, another sweeps grit, a third pours water, and a fourth says, "Okay, now the pretty pass." If you ever form a band, you decide to name it the Pretty Pass. Medium chance of chart success, high chance of well-aligned album art. Here's a curiosity that refuses to be quiet. Near the base, you find a short bore, no deeper than 2 knuckles, ending in a circular floor with faint spiral striations. If you've spent too many nights reading arguments on the internet, no judgment, you've seen this movie. Fringe enthusiasts point to such spirals and claim ancient rotary drills powered by unknown methods, tubular tools cutting with impossible feed rates, perhaps even resonant devices if the conversation gets ambitious. The less romantic answer is also less viral. A hand-driven drill with a hollow reed or copper tube, plenty of abrasive, and the patience of a saint produces spiral tracks when pressure and rotation vary. Historians still argue whether specific patterns in ancient cores prove exotic technology or simply the fussy way grit and human wrists behave over long mornings. You shift your weight and a flake whispers away from the surface. It reveals a thin skin of darker patina shading into lighter stone beneath, a tan line drawn by ages of weather. Where the surface was freshly worked, the color is paler. Where time had its say, it's richer, more chocolate gray. The contrast turns tool zones into a map, fresh in the deep cuts, old along untouched shoulders. If you wanted to play detective, you could chart relative phases from hue alone, though the wind would erase your notes the second you bragged about them. Halfway up the face, you discover a panel where the stone wears a subtle sheen. Not glassy, but satiny, as if an abrasive slurry was fed over and over across a flat-held square to the world. The passes faintly overlap and tiny quartz grains wink when the sun shifts, like the rock is keeping a pocket full of stars for emergencies. You put your cheek near the surface and speak a word. The panel returns it cleanly, brighter than the surrounding rough. Accidental acoustics? Maybe. Or a polisher who liked their work to sound as neat as it looked. You mark out a small grid with your eyes, cataloging scars. Pecking lanes tend to climb diagonally, right-handed more than left. Saw grooves favor a shallower stroke on the return. Abrasion lines bunch at edges where the tool entered awkward angles. The pattern looks like exactly what it is, a conversation between intent and geology. Where the crystal fabric ran difficult, the marks cluster like stubborn knots in wood. Where the grain consented, the surface turns even, almost smug. If rocks had Yelp, this one would be leaving a 3-star review for the pecking crew and a "would hire again" for whoever ran the slurry station. Down low, tucked near a wind pocket, a cluster of tiny drill divots forms a ragged constellation. They don't go deep. They look like starts, not finishes. Layout points, the beginnings of dowel holes for lifting toggles. You imagine a mason testing positions, then changing the plan. It's endearing to find indecision fossilized, proof that even heroic projects accumulate their share of not that moments. Welcome, relatable humans. Your committee meeting is preserved in silica. A mainstream fact gives your wonder a seatbelt. Across several megalithic traditions we find bosses, small protrusions left on otherwise finished blocks. They can be used for levers or slings during transport, then knocked away later. Some, though, survive on purpose, possibly as alignment aids or signatures. You find one here. A low, rounded nub the size of a child's fist, soft-edged by time. It sits exactly where a strap would have kissed the stone. Functional? Almost certainly. Symbolic? Possibly. Tempting to boop? Absolutely. You resist with heroic maturity for a count of 3, then give it the gentlest approval tap. Science. Just when you're getting cocky about reading the surface, the stone plays a trick. A long, straight, incised line runs ruler true for a span, then stops at nothing. No joint, no change in material, no edge that needs it. You follow it with a fingernail and feel the tiniest burrs, like a stylus trembled once or twice. A layout line perhaps struck in before the deeper work and never erased. Or a later visitor with a bronze point and opinions. You file it under probably practical, possibly petty, and promise not to overfit the data. The human brain sees zebras often. Sometimes it's a very striped horse. A gust climbs the face and lifts your hair in a parody of heroism. You shift to the leeward side and notice another oddity. A recessed pocket no wider than a hand, its back wall polished smoother than a bowl. Inside, a few grains of black sand glitter. Local rumor says such pockets once held offerings, resin, oil, petals, or even bronze mirrors to signal at distance. A quirkier rumor says they're tone cups, small resonators that sweeten chants. You try humming softly into the recess. The tone blooms a fraction, like tea finding hot water. Historians still argue whether such features had liturgical function or were simply practical. Handholds for temporary scaffold planks, say, later adopted by imagination because imagination hates empty shelves. You step back to take in a broader panel and realize the surface finish changes by altitude. Rough at the base, satin in the middle, rough again higher up where access was harder. That reads like scaffolding phases. A crew could easily reach waist to shoulder. Above that, platforms or ladders complicate life, and the finish tells on the difficulty. You grin at the insight, then immediately remember that you have trouble changing a light bulb without a chair and feel less smug. One last pattern steals your attention. In oblique light, a faint mesh emerges, crisscrossing micro scratches aligned in 2 dominant bearings. It looks like someone cross-hatched the stone with a gritty pad, perhaps as a final leveling technique. The mesh fades where the grain rebels and deepens where the surface took the treatment evenly. You test it with your palm. The friction is uniform, the way a good carpenter adores a properly planned board. Somewhere an ancient supervisor looked at this patch and said, "Yes, that," which is a sentence managers have been chasing ever since. You straighten slowly, knees lodging a polite complaint. In front of you is not a mystery instead of craft. It's a mystery through craft. The marks are legible enough to prove long labor by human hands, yet peculiar enough to keep a doorway open to questions. About sequence, about tools, about the portion of the toolkit made of perishable things we no longer see. Historians still argue whether unusual traces, spiral drill textures, satin flats in awkward positions, ruler-true incisions that lead nowhere, signal lost methods, or simply the edge cases of well-understood techniques pushed very, very far. Before you move, you pick a spot where 3 languages share a corner: pecking, sawing, and polish. You lay your palm there and feel the surface change from stipple to glide under one handspan. It's like touching a textbook, only the chapter titles are in stone. You smile despite the wind's ongoing audition for Best Supporting Howl and step back. One last joke floats through your head as you brush dust from your knees. If effort could fossilize, this whole face would glow in the dark. It doesn't, of course, at least not until lightning takes a strong opinion, but the feeling remains. The megalith doesn't brag. It lets the tool marks do that on its behalf in a quiet grammar of taps, strokes, and grit. You read what you can, admit what you can't, and agree to come back with better questions. You edge along the base where the stone's flank meets a tangle of undergrowth. The air changes here. Less wind, more scent, damp earth, crushed herbs underfoot, and the faint mineral tang that stones release when they've held rain. A lizard flicks across your path and vanishes into a crack no wider than a coin slot. You imagine it living rent-free in one of history's priciest walls. The terrain dips slightly, funneling you toward a lower seam in the monolith's geometry. The join between two massive faces is so tight you can't slide a fingernail into it. The precision is absurd for blocks this size. A mainstream fact slips into place. At sites like Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuaman, Inca masons cut stones to fit so precisely that centuries later, earthquakes could rattle the ground without disturbing the joints. It wasn't magic. It was careful dressing, patient trial and error, and the habit of matching faces in situ before final placement. Still, here you are, muttering to yourself as if the fit is a personal insult. A fringe-friendly curiosity creeps in along the seam. Some alternative theorists point to odd undulations in certain joints and speculate about stone softening techniques, geopolymers, unknown chemical treatments, or even acoustic shaping. You lean in and trace a gentle concavity that feels intentional, like two puzzle pieces molded together. The official view is simpler. Laborers dressed stones to match each other's unique bulges and hollows, producing a wiggle that actually strengthens the joint. Historians still argue whether unusual tight curves in megalithic joints are proof of advanced shaping methods or just artisans indulging their perfectionism. From this angle, you spot something most visitors miss. Faint incised lines running parallel to the joint, offset by a few centimeters. They don't go deep, and they terminate abruptly. Survey marks, decorative framing, or the ancient equivalent of cut here that never got the follow-up. You're tempted to imagine a foreman shouting up from the ground, "No, the other left," and a mason rolling his eyes in whatever language was fashionable before history started keeping score. Climbing a little onto a flanking outcrop, you gain a sideways perspective on the monolith's height. Above you, vertical striations run like draped fabric down the face. Some fade into nothing halfway down, others cut into tool marks you saw earlier. It's like reading layers in a palimpsest, eras overwriting each other without fully erasing the past. A mainstream explanation fits neatly. Weathering patterns often follow microfractures or mineral veins producing vertical streaks. Rainwater carrying dissolved minerals can etch these channels deeper over centuries. But the quirkier read, whispered in corners of fringe forms, is that these could be remnants of rope burns from lowering or raising the stones. Fibers saturated with grit wearing slow scars into the surface. You file it under unlikely but oddly cinematic. Your foot catches on a protrusion. A boss left proud from the face, this one not rounded but squared off like a stubby handle. Its top surface is slightly hollowed, holding a puddle from the morning rain. The reflection shows a skewed fragment of sky and your own face, upside down and vaguely bewildered. A younger version of you might have dipped a hand in, hoping for visions. Tonight you just note the detail. Some bosses were clearly used as lifting points or leverage anchors, but their survival often comes down to no one bothered to knock this one off. A gust threads through the seam like air through a flute, producing a low, breathy hum. You pause, surprised. The pitch changes when you shift a few centimeters, like a game of hide-and-seek between your ears and the stone. Locals, you've read, sometimes attribute such tones to spirit voices or guardian calls. The engineering-minded will counter with simple acoustics. Narrow gaps and irregular chambers can resonate under the right wind conditions. Historians still argue whether certain placements and gaps were tuned intentionally for sound, or if the whole phenomenon is just a happy accident nature occasionally throws in as a bonus track. You keep moving until you reach a shallow recess cut into the stone, waist-high, rectangular with sharp internal corners. It's clean enough that you can picture a wooden lintel once fitting here, maybe holding a carved panel or a functional shutter. You run your fingers along the edges and feel fine chisel chatter, the kind that only happens when the mason refuses to let a corner go soft. There's no surviving panel, of course, just a square shadow where something used to be. Somewhere in the universe, there's a warehouse of lost architectural bits neatly labeled "will never be found." At your feet, small fragments of the parent stone litter the ground, angular chips, some with fresh-looking fracture planes, others dulled by weather. They speak of spalling, of frost finding a way into tiny weaknesses and prying with slow, icy hands. One piece bears a clear, deliberate groove. You hold it to the light, wondering whether it was scrap from initial shaping or a discarded section of some later modification. If this were a crime scene, you'd bag it as evidence. Instead, you set it back where you found it. The stone's story is already missing enough pages without you walking off with one, stepping back to see the whole seam again. You notice how the two faces almost, but not quite, mirror each other's micro-features. A bump on one aligns with a depression on the other, the way you'd design it if you wanted them to interlock without movement. If the seam is the handshake, the bumps and hollows are the fingers. And once you see the handshake, you can't unsee it. This is cooperation between two giants. A stray thought ambushes you. If modern brick walls could talk, they'd probably envy this fit. No mortar, no rebar, just two slabs deciding to stick together because that's what they were dressed for. And no matter how much concrete your century pours, the odds are good that in another 3,000 years this joint will still be quietly showing off to anyone with enough patience to kneel in the weeds. The light shifts again and the seam's shadow thins. You realize you've been squatting here longer than your knees appreciate. Straightening, you feel that particular ache that whispers you've learned something, even if you can't quite name it yet. You know the joint is remarkable. You know the theories are many, and you know historians still argue whether such feats came from lost methods or from nothing more than persistence sharpened to an art. And in the hum of the wind through the stone, you hear what might be the only answer you'll get tonight. A long, low note that could mean anything or nothing or everything, depending on how much you want to believe. You follow the base of the monolith until the land opens into a shallow terrace. The kind that feels staged for an audience. Only the actors here are granite and shadow. The ground is strewn with smaller stones as if the monolith had once been surrounded by children who grew up and wandered away. Some of these smaller blocks are clearly worked, flattened faces, crisp edges, and that telltale polish that comes from tools sliding over the same surface again and again. You crouch beside one, noticing a neat series of dimples carved along one edge. Mainstream archaeologists would call them lug holes, or lug marks, possibly meant for securing ropes or wooden clamps. At sites across the world, such marks are mundane signs of construction methods, functional, not mystical. Still, you can't help the quirkier possibility slipping in. In some fringe accounts, these dimples are interpreted as part of a language of the stone, a code left behind for future builders who would supposedly return when the world was ready. Historians still argue whether repetitive marks like these are purely practical or if they carried symbolic meaning beyond the build site. Beyond the terrace, the ground drops into a scatter of boulders half swallowed by soil and plants. You take your time navigating, occasionally testing the heft of a loose rock, as if one might offer a clue. Most are stubbornly ordinary. One, though, catches the light at a perfect angle, revealing a faint spiral incised into its surface. It's shallow, worn to the edge of recognition, but it draws your fingertip along its curve almost without asking. Spirals turn up everywhere. Prehistoric art, seashells, galaxies, so it's easy to read too much into one. You let yourself imagine the ancient carver thinking, well, it looked nice on my pottery, why not here? Before moving on. A little further on, you encounter an upright block leaning at a dangerous angle, like a bookshelf someone forgot to finish assembling. Its top edge is beveled in a way that suggests it was meant to meet another surface, but there's nothing above it now. You press your palm against it and feel faint warmth stored from the sun, proof that, for all the mystery, this is still just a rock doing its job in the daylight. And yet, that tilt. If it fell tomorrow, it might reveal a buried joint or chamber beneath. You briefly imagine archaeologists 50 years from now celebrating the find of the century because gravity finally did them a favor. The terrace edge offers a sweeping view back toward the main face of the monolith, and from here, you spot patterns you missed up close. Subtle differences in color mark where lichen colonies have claimed territory over the centuries. In some cases, the colonies follow faint carved lines, accidental bio-highlighting of shapes invisible at other times of day. One mainstream fact stands out. Lichen can be used in lichenometry, a dating method that estimates the age of exposed rock surfaces based on the size of lichen growth. It's not perfect, but it's another tool in the archaeological kit. The fringe version? Some believe certain lichens were deliberately seeded to mark lines or hide carvings until a specific future era. Historians still argue whether ancient builders could or would use living organisms as part of a long-term design. Down in a hollow, you notice a rectangular pit lined with cut stones. It's only a meter deep now, half filled with leaves and silt, but the precision of the lining stones is striking. The walls are tight, the corners almost perfectly square. You picture it as a foundation socket for a now vanished post or altar. Then your mind wanders to less serious theories. Maybe it was just a very committed attempt at a stone hot tub that never caught on. Either way, the fact that it's still intact after untold centuries means whoever built it cared about durability. Possibly more than about explaining their choices to future wanderers like you. A rustle draws your attention uphill, where a solitary tree has rooted itself in a crack of the monolith. Its trunk twists in improbable arcs, tracing the path of least resistance through stone. You know the mainstream explanation. Tree roots can fracture even the hardest rock over time, prying apart tiny fissures with each wet, dry cycle. But in local folklore, plants growing from stone are often taken as signs of blessing or guardianship. Historians still argue whether the presence of certain plants at ancient sites is purely chance, or if ancient peoples cultivated them deliberately for symbolic effect. As you linger, you find yourself looking more at the empty spaces than the stones themselves. The gaps where something once fit, the terraces that seem designed for structures long vanished. The absence is almost louder than the presence. You joke to yourself that ancient builders must have had the same issue as modern homeowners. The moment you finish one project, you already start planning the next, leaving a trail of incomplete but charming features for future generations to puzzle over. Evening light begins to slant low, and the surface of the terrace turns golden. Shadows fill the joints and dimples, making them more pronounced than they were hours ago. It's a reminder that light is as much a tool as any chisel. You imagine a builder standing exactly where you are, adjusting their work as the sun shifted, using shadow as a level and highlight as a guide. The idea is so plausible that for a moment you feel less like a visitor and more like an apprentice running behind schedule. You take one last walk along the terrace before moving on, glancing over your shoulder at the patterns, marks, and empty sockets. None of them will tell you exactly what you want to know. And maybe that's the point. Some structures are built to last. Others are built to last and to tease. This one, you suspect, excels at both. You descend a narrow slope carved almost entirely from bedrock, the path weaving between outcrops as if following a long-forgotten procession route. Loose gravel crunches underfoot, and the air cools noticeably as the hillside shields you from the sun. At a bend, you pause to catch your breath and realize you're standing beside a wall of fitted stones, not as massive as the monolith, but with an unsettling precision. Each block sits flush against its neighbors, the joins so tight that even a modern razor blade would find no purchase. Mainstream historians point to examples like this in places such as Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo in Peru, where Inca stonemasons shaped blocks to interlock without mortar. The technique was earthquake-resistant, practical in a seismically active region. Yet tucked into the corner of one block, you notice something odd. A small, perfect hole drilled deep into the stone. It's too round to be natural, too precise to be a careless chip. A quirky theory suggests such holes were part of a now-lost technology for softening stone, an idea popular among fringe researchers who like to imagine the ancients wielded science beyond our own. Historians still argue whether these holes are purely functional, perhaps for levers or pegs, or hints at a vanished craft. A little further on, the path flattens into what might once have been a platform. From here, you can see the valley stretching out in both directions, its slopes patterned with terraces. Some are clearly agricultural, their retaining walls still intact. Others are irregular, as if carved for reasons no one can quite pin down. You joke under your breath that maybe they were just experimenting with landscape feng shui long before the phrase existed. At the far side of the platform, you spot a boulder with a deliberate split down its center. It's clean enough to look mechanical, though weathered by centuries of exposure. The mainstream explanation? Repeated heating and cooling, or wedges driven in with wooden stakes that swelled when wet. The fringe explanation? Sonic or vibrational tools supposedly able to part rock without leaving tool marks. Historians still argue whether such methods ever existed, or if we're simply underestimating ancient patience. A narrow ledge leads you around the back of the wall, where you find something that stops you mid-step. A carving in low relief, nearly erased by time, of what appears to be a figure holding a staff. The lines are faint, but there's a deliberate curve to the shoulders, a tilt to the head. Mainstream archaeologists might call it an abstract anthropomorphic form, a ceremonial figure whose exact meaning is lost. The quirky alternative? Some claim such figures are watchers, guardians placed to oversee sacred spaces. Historians still argue whether these shapes are stylized humans, deities, or just the prehistoric equivalent of generic decoration. You trace the outline with your fingertips and notice how the carving's placement catches the light from only one narrow angle. Step 2 paces to the left and the figure vanishes into shadow. It's a clever trick, intentional, you suspect, like an ancient version of augmented reality. You can't help but grin at the thought of builders smirking to themselves as they set up these visual surprises. Past the wall, the ground rises again into a spine of rock. Here, the path is less obvious, but small piles of stones, cairns, mark the way. These could be recent, built by modern hikers, or they could be ancient, a breadcrumb trail for travelers who knew the route. You knock one lightly with your foot and instantly regret it when it wobbles dangerously. You steady it quickly, muttering a half apology to whoever stacked it, whether centuries ago or last week. A gust of wind carries a faint scent, damp earth, crushed plants, and the mineral tang of stone. You imagine how different this route would have felt in the rainy season, when water might cascade down these steps and turn the entire platform into a temporary stage for nature. One fact holds true. Ancient Andean cultures often built along routes that aligned with both practical travel and ceremonial processions. And the quirkier notion? Some believe these pathways were also energetic lines, conduits of earth power linking significant sites. Historians still argue whether such alignments are intentional or coincidental. By the time you crest the ridge, the sun is sliding toward late afternoon, throwing long shadows across the valley floor. You look back at the wall, now half hidden by terrain. and marvel at how seamlessly it blends with its surroundings when viewed from a distance. Up close, it's a marvel of skill. From afar, it's part of the mountain, as if the builders wanted their work to be both revealed and concealed depending on the viewer's position. You can't help but think of the monolith again. The way it commands attention in one moment and disappears into landscape in another. Here, the wall feels like its quieter sibling. Less imposing, but just as deliberate. You wonder if they were part of the same plan, or if this wall was a later addition by people trying to match the grandeur of something they didn't fully understand. The wind tugs at your sleeve as if nudging you onward. You take one last glance over the edge of the platform, letting your eyes follow the invisible lines connecting wall, terraces, and monolith. They don't give up their pattern easily, but the feeling that one exists is hard to shake. Like an answer just at the tip of your tongue, waiting for the right light, the right season, the right century to reveal itself. You follow the ridge down to the village with the steady patience of someone who has been trained by stone all day. Roofs tilt like cards dealt onto a green felt table, and smoke threads up from a handful of cook fires. The wind falls quiet in the alleys, turning into gentle eddies that move dust, then let it settle again, as if the air itself is tidying before you arrive. You ask after the municipal archive, the kind of place that sounds bigger than it is, and a boy points you to a clay-colored building with a bell that looks retired but opinionated. Inside, the light goes soft. Shelves lean under the weight of ledgers, missionary journals, land surveys, and boxes of photographs that smell like old rain. A woman at the desk lifts her glasses and gives you the same look a cat gives a new chair. Cautious approval. You explain your after mentions of a very old stone on the high plateau. She nods, like this is a perfectly normal errand for a Tuesday, and leads you into a back room where the dust motes do slow ballet. The table embraces the sprawl of paper you produce, and you begin the ritual. Open, skim, squint, repeat. The first stack is colonial-era chronicles, travelers with tidy handwriting and large opinions. One writes of a pillar of thunder on a lonely height, a stone that drank lightning and spoke in the voice of the wind. He also insists the villagers made chocolate that could cure sadness, so you adjust the reliability dial accordingly. But your fingers prick at the phrasing. Pillar of Thunder isn't a bad poetic label for what you saw. A mainstream grounding fact takes a seat at the table. In the Andes, written records before the 16th century are scarce. The Inca used quipu, chord records of knots and colors to track tribute, people, and goods, but alphabetic or pictographic writing systems like the ones in Mesoamerica didn't develop here. Much of what we know about pre-conquest Andean sites comes from archaeology and from Spanish accounts filtered through their agendas. You let that context settle like a paperweight on your stack of hopes. The archivist brings a tray of photographs, black and white prints from the 1930s, a survey team smiling bravely at altitude, hats like upturned bowls. One image shows the monolith's flank with a young willow just a stick at its base. You compare it to the tree you saw today, now a twisted gymnast prying stone with slow insistence. You make a note that trees keep better time than people and consider pitching that to a watch company. They will not invest. A ledger from a Jesuit mission turns up a stranger line. On the feast of St. Bartholomew, the stone was crowned with fire. The shepherds refused the field for 3 nights. Lightning, probably, but whoever wrote it made it sound like a coronation. A quirky tidbit tags along. Tucked in the margin is a tiny drawing, a rectangle with a zigzag crown. Is it a doodle? A symbol? Or a bored scribe refusing to waste a perfectly good margin? Historians still argue whether marginalia like this preserves local motifs or just preserves the universal habit of drawing during long meetings. The archivist returns with a folded map, edges like pastry. It's a merchant's chart from 2 centuries ago with roots drawn as if the earth were a polite quilt of lines. Near a bend labeled in a hand that loved flourishes, a little icon marks your plateau, not a mountain, not a church, but a single block. Next to it, the words, Piedra del Vigia, the Watcher's Stone. You feel the snap of recognition you get when a stranger says your nickname without prompting. The map, sluggish from age, gives up its secret without fuss. She brings you another box, copied pages from faraway archives. A traveler from the coast mentions a high stone like those of other worlds, comparing it to tales he heard of a single monolith on an island across the sea. A hint that sailors trade architecture as readily as spices. Another fragment from a mission school lists local marvels in tidy script. A waterfall that disappears in dry season. A stone that sings in wind. A valley that smells of cinnamon after rain. The stone has fans. The Cinnamon Valley deserves a field trip. You flip into a set of ethnographic notes from the 1970s. The researcher tried to capture myths before they thinned. One elder described a road for the sky people and placed the monolith as the mile marker, a waypost between peaks where messages were carried by light. That phrasing winks at your memory of the lightning tales. But the same notebook also contains a recipe for festival stew with 3 kinds of corn and a drawing of a dog wearing a hat, so you keep your skepticism caffeinated. You ask about anything older still, and the archivist produces a folder with rubbings from petroglyph sites in distant valleys. Spirals, llamas, eyes, ladders, the usual cast. On one sheet, a tall rectangle is etched with a cross-hatched belly. A smaller rectangle carved within it like a doorway that refuses to open. The caption, added by a patient hand decades ago, reads, "Likely a house, but the proportion nags at you." You lay the rubbing beside a quick sketch you made of the monolith's shallow recess, and your brain does that gratifying click it loves. Are you forcing rhyme? Maybe. Are you enjoying it? Definitely. For balance, you drop into a stack of foreign travelers' journals, polite chaos in multiple languages. One sailor claims to have seen a wall in the clouds on a voyage near an entirely different continent, and swears if you hum at the right pitch, the stone answers. Another missionary writes of a mark on the earth placed before Babel, which is a theological flex more than a date. Between allegory and aching feet, the truth keeps its hat on. You catch your reflection in a window and realize how far you've drifted into the romance of the archive. So you tether yourself with another fact. When ancient texts elsewhere talk about pillars, they often mean things like the Ashokan columns in India. 3rd century BCE stone pillars inscribed with edicts, placed on roads and at sacred sites. Those are historical, dated, and very much products of known states. Your plateau's stone, by contrast, is mute and aloof, uninscribed in any way a printer would recognize. The comparison helps clear the mist. Similarity in silhouette doesn't prove kinship in history. Still, your stack of voices begins to harmonize. Watcher, thunder, road in the sky, singing wind. They circle the same theme. You jot the phrases in a column and realize it reads like soft instructions for how to meet the stone. Look up, listen, expect weather, bring patience. The archivist peeks over your shoulder and adds, "And bring a jacket," which is the most accurate annotation all day. In a folder of municipal council minutes, you find a pragmatic note. A 19th century mayor argued against quarrying near the plateau because the old stone keeps the travelers honest. You wonder what that means. A landmark, a moral compass, or just a reminder that some things in the world are bigger than your fence line. You underline it and star it because a good line deserves a little ceremony. As the afternoon leans toward amber, the archivist places one last object on the table. A glass slide, faded, delicate. She sets it on a light box and a ghost of the monolith appears, flanked by 2 men in wool coats. At the base, Someone has propped a slate with a chalked date and the word Vigia. The men are small. The stone is not, and the caption needs no flourishing. You feel the quiet thrill that photographs still know how to deliver. The proof that time has been here before and behaved itself long enough to be recorded. You close the boxes and help reshelve the ledgers. Outside, the sky has turned the color of brass, and the bell on the roof decides to creak for no practical reason. You breathe cool air and feel the day's pages settle inside your head. You didn't find a birth certificate for the monolith, and you didn't expect one. What you did find is a chorus. Villagers, missionaries, surveyors, sailors, a mayor with good lines, an elder with a cosmic road. They don't agree on the details. They agree on the curve of your feeling when you stand before the stone. On the walk back up through the lanes, you rehearse the reasonable conclusion you'll have to respect. Without inscriptions or datable organic material, the oldest mentions are still just mentions. Historians still argue whether scattered references across centuries point to one unchanged monument or to a family of stones that wear the same myths like shared clothing. You can live with that. It makes room for tomorrow's discovery and spares you from the kind of certainty that turns curiosity into furniture. At the last corner, a dog looks up from a nap and decides you're harmless. You accept the official clearance and head toward the path you'll take at dawn. The archive's dust has followed you, a faint spice on your sleeves. You think of the words on your list: Watcher, Thunder Road, and Smile. Paper and stone don't often speak the same language, but tonight they at least share a dialect. The path back to the plateau greets you like an old friend who doesn't believe in small talk. Straight into the climb, no gentle warm-up. Your legs negotiate terms. Your lungs weigh in with their usual opinions, and the morning light plays referee. Behind you, the village has already shrunk into a neat patchwork, the smoke from breakfast fires curling into the sky as if the day itself is stretching. Ahead, the monolith waits, unmoved by your return, but you suspect it notices more than it lets on. As you crest the first rise, you pass the gnarled willow again. It leans in a fraction more than yesterday, as if it heard your conversations in the archive and wants a progress report. You pat its trunk in a silent working on it and continue upward. The air here tastes sharper, the kind that wakes you without permission. The ridge narrows, flanked by slopes that seem determined to outgreen each other, and somewhere below, a river whispers about being late for its appointment with the sea. Halfway up, you pause. Not because you need to, you tell yourself, but because the view demands it. From this height, the valley's roads look like threads abandoned on a tailor's table. The rooftops gleam in patches, and the plateau's flat crown rises ahead, etched with the memory of your boots. You think of the phrase from the map, Piedra del Vigía, the Watcher's Stone, and admit it fits. You're climbing not just toward a stone, but toward something that has been keeping score longer than your entire species has been a contender. When you reach the top, the light has shifted enough to change the monolith's mood. Yesterday's gray steel has softened to a warm bronze. Shadows from nearby outcrops crawl slowly over its face like careful hands. You walk around it, tracing the shallow recess with your fingers, noting the coolness of the stone where the sun hasn't touched. If the archive gave you the chorus of human voices, here you get the bass note, the soundless, steady hum of a thing that has been exactly here while everything else auditioned for permanence. A mainstream, well-anchored fact lands like a pebble in your thoughts. Throughout history, monoliths have often served as territorial markers, ceremonial focal points, or astronomical aids. From the dolmens of Western Europe to the obelisks of ancient Egypt, humans have been hauling and shaping big rocks for reasons both sacred and practical. Your plateau's stone could fit in any of those categories or none. You can't tell if the alignment with the distant peaks is a celestial calendar, a happy accident, or just the path of least resistance for whoever placed it. The quirky tidbit today arrives courtesy of your own senses. When you press your ear against the stone, you hear something faint. Not a hum exactly, but a soft resonance, as if the rock is playing host to the wind's private concert. Could just be the blood in your head, of course. Or the willow's roots telling long stories underground. Either way, you stay there longer than you mean to, like someone lingering at the last note of a favorite song. You take out your notebook and jot down the questions that have been growing like moss. Who shaped it? How did they get it here? Was it already here, coaxed into its current form by human hands? Or was it left behind by the earth itself, an accidental monument that people then wrapped in meaning? Historians still argue whether unworked standing stones in ancient landscapes should be counted as human monuments or as landscapes with very good PR. The plateau is wide enough to feel like its own country. You walk its edges looking for other signs, broken pottery, flint chips, anything that might give the monolith company in the archaeological record. Mostly you find lichen. But near the northern edge, you spot a flat slab half-buried, carved with a groove that feels deliberate, a fragment of something larger, a workbench for the gods, or less romantically, a place to butcher llamas. You decide not to choose just yet. From this vantage, the view sweeps far enough to make yesterday's archive feel like a low-ceiling dream. Mountains shoulder each other in slow motion, and the river carves its silver path through the middle distance. You imagine ancient travelers stopping here, not just for navigation, but to feel the same unreasonably good air you're breathing now. If you're honest, part of you hopes they also had snacks. You decide to test a theory. Standing in line with the stone's tallest edge, you face the rising sun and mark where its shadow falls. You scratch the spot into the soil and make a mental note to return in the afternoon. If the shadow's movement reveals a pattern, a seasonal marker, a solstice trick, you might be standing in the middle of a prehistoric clock. Or you might be standing in the middle of a prehistoric lawn ornament. The stakes are equally fun. As noon approaches, the plateau's breeze freshens, and the monolith's bronze shifts back toward its sterner steel. You feel the warmth from the sun vanish from one side of its face as clouds gather. A hawk arcs overhead, scanning the ground with the kind of focus you wish you could rent for research. The clouds pass, the light returns, and you realize how quickly the stone changes personality when the sky does. You wander to the plateau's far side, where the ground dips into a shallow bowl. Here, wildflowers mass in colors so bright they look like someone left the saturation slider too high. You crouch among them, finding tiny blue petals shaped like teardrops, and imagine ancient hands picking them, maybe to weave into garlands for whatever ceremony once took place here. The idea is pure speculation, but it makes the air smell sweeter. By the time you circle back to the monolith, its shadow has swung perceptibly. Your morning scratch in the dirt now lies far to the left. If you had weeks instead of days, you could track this properly, log its extremes, and maybe find out if the Watcher's Stone watches the heavens as closely as it watches the valleys. You add it to the long list of things you'd do if you could stay. On the walk down, you glance back one last time. From this angle, the stone looks almost like a doorway, tall, narrow, waiting. You picture stepping through into a version of the world where the builders are still here, speaking a language you'd learn for the sake of a single answer. Or maybe they'd laugh and tell you it's just a rock, and the real point was the climb. Either way, you'll be back tomorrow. Stones don't move, but sometimes the way you see them does, and you're not finished looking. The next morning begins with a sky so clear it feels like someone took the time to polish it overnight. You walk the ridge trail with the easy rhythm of someone who's done it enough to know exactly where each loose stone waits to trip you. Below, the river glitters with the smug self-satisfaction of a body of water that knows it looks good from any angle. You glance toward the plateau and see the Watcher's Stone catching the early light, its shadow still long and sharp, like the hand of a clock just after sunrise. You reach the top earlier than usual, the air still carrying a chill. Today, you're not here just to admire. You've brought a few simple tools, a compass, some chalk, and a string line. It's not exactly the arsenal of a professional archaeologist, but it's enough to satisfy your curiosity without attracting the suspicion of any time-traveling builders who might still be watching. Your first order of business is to measure the stone's orientation. Standing flush against its broader face, you align the compass, noting that it points almost perfectly along a north-south axis. That's a mainstream, widely accepted historical fact you know from countless other sites. Many ancient structures, from Stonehenge to the Great Pyramids, align closely with cardinal directions. Whether this was for astronomical purposes, spiritual symbolism, or sheer practicality is still debated, but it's rarely accidental. As you circle the base, you find something unexpected. A tiny fossil embedded in the stone's lower corner. It's spiral-shaped, delicate as a seashell, and seems absurdly out of place on a highland plateau. This is your quirky tidbit for the day, a reminder that the stone's story began long before humans were even part of the cast. You smile at the thought that this fossilized little swirl might be the oldest thing you've touched all week. With the chalk, you mark where the morning shadow falls, then stretch the string line along it to get a clean reading. You take another mark an hour later, and the difference is noticeable. This is the slow magic of a sundial, even if it's one big enough to intimidate any garden gnome that tried to stand next to it. Historians still argue whether these alignments in prehistoric monuments were intentional calendars or just happy coincidences born from trial and error. Your marks, won't settle that debate, but they do make you feel like you're part of it. You step back and take in the entire plateau, wondering if there were once other stones here forming a circle or an avenue. If they existed, they're gone now, buried or repurposed. The absence is almost louder than the presence of the monolith itself. You imagine ancient builders hauling others into place, then time slowly undoing their work, like a patient tide erasing a sandcastle. A breeze picks up, carrying the scent of wild herbs from the slope below. You kneel to inspect a patch of thyme that's somehow thriving in the thin soil between rock cracks. It's a sensory bridge across centuries. You can picture someone from thousands of years ago picking the same plant, maybe to flavor a stew or offer in a ritual. It's humbling to think that both you and they would have agreed on the taste. The rest of the morning passes in a quiet rhythm of observation and note-taking. You try different vantage points, standing far back to see how the monolith frames the surrounding landscape. From one spot, it lines up perfectly with a distant mountain pass, a potential travel route for ancient people. From another, it sits dead center in the view of a far-off peak, which might have been a sacred site, or, as your more skeptical side suggests, it's just where the builders happened to stop when they got tired. By midday, the sun's heat settles over the plateau like a warm blanket you didn't ask for. You retreat to the shadow of the stone, which feels several degrees cooler. Sitting there, you realize how much you've started to treat this place like an old friend, one you don't need to talk to constantly, just share space with. You sketch the fossil in your notebook along with the morning's compass readings and then lean back against the monolith. Somewhere in the distance, an eagle cries out, the sound carrying clear and sharp in the thin air. You close your eyes and imagine the same call echoing here thousands of years ago, heard by someone whose name will never make it into any record. The thought is oddly comforting. It means the stone isn't the only constant in this place. When you open your eyes, the light has shifted again, and your chalk marks stand out like little beacons in the dirt. You know you'll be back later to see where the afternoon shadow falls. Whether or not you uncover anything groundbreaking, you'll have the satisfaction of having watched the watcher, if only for a day. Afternoon leans toward that hour when clouds stop pretending to be decorative and start filling out incident reports. You watch a bruise of weather gather over the far ridge, a slow, deliberate bloom that turns blue to slate. The plateau inhales, Your shirt flutters, then settles, then lifts again with a warning you feel in your ribs more than your ears. You mark one last chalk line at the shadow's edge and feel a cool finger run along your knuckles. The stone says what it always says in such moments: stand by. The first gust arrives sideways, a clean shove that staggers you a step and combs the grass in one pass. You plant your feet and laugh, half delight, half, please do not file me under debris. In 10 heartbeats, the temperature drops, and the sky writes a new sentence across itself. A bank of dark piled up like mountains trying on taller hats. Somewhere above, thunder clears its throat. Not a roar yet. A rehearsal. A mainstream fact pushes in, grounding as a tent peg. High plateaus breed their own weather. Orographic lift forces moist air up the slopes. It cools, condenses, and throws tantrums with rain, hail, lightning, and winds that change direction like a cat changes opinions. Ancient Andean sites often sit in these meteorological theaters. Builders knew the scripts, shaping terraces and drains to choreograph runoff and keep foundations dry. You scan the ground and notice shallow channels you hadn't clocked earlier. Stone lips nudging water away from the monolith's base with the courtesy of a maitre d'. The wind climbs from suggestion to agenda. It howls in the seam you loved this morning, turning the gap into a throat flute that plays one low, breathy note, then leaps a third like it remembered a favorite chorus. You grin despite the sting in your eyes. If a conservatory accepted megaliths, this one would teach wind instruments on weekends and refuse to grade on a curve. The first drops do not so much fall as arrive. Big, cold, and spaced like they paid extra for aisle seats. They slap your cheeks and sleeves and dot the stone with dark coins. Then the sky stops being careful. Sheets of rain barrel across the plateau, swept on white ropes of wind. Your jacket earns its keep for 10 heroic seconds before admitting this is a team sport. You back against the monolith's lee side and discover the modest miracle of a dry strip 2 palms wide. Rain curling around you in a silver fringe, leaving your spine in a pocket of grace. You try hard not to feel chosen. You fail, but quietly. Lightning scrawls a fast signature across the ridge. The 7 count comes like a drum roll under wool. Another strike, closer, cracks the world in 2. You smell the shock. Ozone, hot stone, a metallic tang that flips some switch in your hindbrain labeled respect. A quirky tidbit you half love, half fear sidles in. Locals sometimes say the watcher drinks storms, and on certain nights you can see blue fire crawl its flanks without touching it. Scientists have their own poetry. Saint Elmo's fire, a corona discharge that can light edges in electric weather. Historians still argue whether tales of hungry stones reflect real observations of electrical phenomena at sacred sites, or the creative embroidery that thunder invites on long winters. You crouch, palms on your thighs, and watch the rain find every path it needs. Water slaps the satin panel you traced earlier and runs in veils that separate, rejoin, and vanish into joints so tight they could pass for decoration. Where the face bulges, runoff furls sideways, a quick serpent of water that dives for a cut channel and disappears downhill. The plateau answers with 1,000 bright threads, each with a destination it decided on centuries ago. Someone taught this ground to behave in storms, and the lesson stuck. Wind shoves again. Hard enough that your hat goes airborne, wobbles, and flings itself into a bush that will later claim salvage rights. You retrieve it with the kind of dignity only available to people who think no one is watching. The monolith does not comment, which is kind. A blast funnels through the shallow recess, turning it into an amplifier that briefly makes the rain sound like applause. You take a bow you did not earn. You think of safety and step away from the tallest thing on a flat place. Storms make statisticians of us all. Yet you don't go far. 60 paces feels respectful. From there, you watch the lightning stitch bright seams between cloud and ridge, skipping your stone the way a polite guest skirts the host. Is that selection bias? Absolutely. But the watcher looks like it's negotiating with the sky, and who are you to break up a meeting? A mainstream reminder taps your shoulder. Lightning can leave signatures on rock, fused sand tubes called fulgurites, vitrified skins, branching glassy scars. You scan the monolith in bright flashes and think you see faint tracery near the crown. Nothing you can trust from this distance in a moving downpour, but enough to file under check later when not being washed. Somewhere in the valley, thunder rolls long and theatrical. If the storm had a union, it would point to this performance and request hazard pay and applause. You shift your stance and realize the ground under the lee is barely muddy. The drains are working. The lip at the base stutters the water just enough to keep it from chewing a trench. You follow one narrow channel to the plateau's edge, where it dives into a carved slot and vanishes in a clean sheet. It would make an excellent sink if registered with the appropriate authorities. You add ancient hydrology flex to your mental list of uncredited engineering feats. The wind changes key. A colder tongue slips through your wet layers and draws a shiver up your back like a zipper. Hail arrives, enthusiastic but small. Rice grains that ping off stone and rebound into your boots. You check your knuckles and decide your dignity can afford mittens. A quick joke skitters through your teeth. If you wanted exfoliation, you could have booked a spa. The sky, unfazed, doubles your treatment at no additional cost. For 5 strange minutes, the plateau looks like a black and white film. Hail whitening the grass, rock gone to charcoal. You a moving smear in the scene. The monolith stands untroubled, its edges sharpen under the pelting as if contrast were invented for days like this. The seam tone returns, a breathier note now tuned by ice instead of rain. You whistle an answering line without thinking, and the wind steals it and does nothing useful with it, which is on brand. Then, as suddenly as it began, the worst of it steps away. Rain softens to steady. Hail shrinks to pepper and quits. The thunder walks off to scold another ridge. You stand blinking as the plateau exhales steam from 100 small mouths. The monolith wears a wet sheen that turns it younger by a century. Water pearls in the drill divots, live streaming tiny skies. You walk the perimeter in that after-storm hush that feels like a library, slowly remembering it is a forest. Every cut and groove you studied this morning is newly legible, inked by water and shadow. You crouch at the shallow recess, now a small basin, and watch a sheet of runoff pour past in a thread so thin you want to name it. A swallow stitches the air overhead, harvesting bugs that made the same post-storm mistake you did, coming out too soon. At the base, along the leeward strip that sheltered you, the soil is barely damp. You press a palm flat. The stone is cool now, a stored evening released early. You lay your cheek against it and let your breath fog a small circle. The storm has rearranged the palette. The sky is pale pewter. The far hills glow a wet green you could drink. Every lichened word on the rock reads darker, truer. You collect your chalk, now a paste, and smear a small grin on the back of your hand because sometimes survival deserves a doodle. You retrieve your hat from the custody bush and offer it parole with time served. The plateau resumes its usual business. Wind negotiating salaries with grass, water paying taxes to the river, stone keeping minutes no one will read. You think the same thought you always think after weather like this. If anyone meant to protect the watcher, they chose well. Nature is a stern guard with flexible hours. Historians still argue whether sites like this were placed to harness storms symbolically, to talk to sky and water with shapes, or simply because high ground is where you put a landmark if you want it noticed. Either way, the result is the same. A stone that looks like it belongs to the weather as much as to the earth. You turn once more to the horizon. The clouds part just enough to let a thin blade of light skate across the monolith's face, catching on a polished patch you hadn't seen shine before. It flares, winks, and goes quiet. You raise a hand without meaning to and return the salute. Then you shoulder your damp pack and start back along the familiar path, your footsteps lighter than the sky has any right to allow. Behind you, the seam hums a last low vowel as the wind loses interest. Ahead, the trail gleams in places, a breadcrumb line of puddles. You walk between them like a careful giant in a children's book, trying not to smash the shiny worlds. The plateau lets you go without comment, which in this language might be the highest compliment. Evening begins to drape itself across the plateau, a slow spill of shadow that lengthens the watcher's silhouette until it seems to touch the far ridge. The air has that post-storm crispness, every scent sharpened, wet stone, clean earth, and the faint metallic tang left behind by lightning's passage. You keep walking the arc around the monolith, watching how the lowering sun finds new ways to ignite its flanks. Every few steps, a groove catches the light, flashing like some private signal between the stone and the horizon. A widely accepted fact slides into place. In many ancient cultures, sunset wasn't just the end of the day. It was a sacred exchange. The Inca aligned entire temples so the solstice sun would slip into a notch on a distant mountain. Even here, far from Cusco, the builders may have known the exact geometry needed to make this monolith converse with the setting sun. You pause, line up the tallest ridge with a shallow notch on the stone, and feel the satisfying click of coincidence, or perhaps design. The wind is gentler now, carrying stray notes from a bird you can't see. The plateau's grass lies flattened in storm-made whorls, looking like the world's largest fingerprint. A joke drifts in before you can stop it. If this is the god's signature, they really need a better pen. Still, the patterns feel intentional somehow, as if the weather signed the guest book on its way out. You edge closer to the seam you traced earlier. The water from the storm still trickles through, but slower now, a silver vein in a dark face. You lean in, ear nearly touching the rock, and hear it. An almost voice, the kind you get when you put your head to a conch shell. Historians still argue whether such features were carved for acoustics or simply emerged from natural erosion. Some researchers suggest these recesses could focus sound, amplifying chants or music during ceremonies. Others dismiss that as wishful thinking shaped by romantic ears. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. In the 1970s, a field team swore they heard rhythmic drumming echo from a similar monolith during a windstorm. No drums were ever found. Locals shrugged and said the stone likes to remember parties. You press your palm to the surface now, half hoping it's in the mood to reminisce. The sun continues its descent, and the plateau begins to glow. Not from the stone, but from the light bouncing off damp ground. Puddles turn into molten gold coins scattered at your feet. You take careful steps, avoiding them as though you're in a museum and the exhibits are easily offended. Overhead, the clouds have thinned to pink gauze, stretching lazily in a sky that looks freshly washed. The monolith casts its longest shadow yet, a vast spear of darkness aimed directly toward the edge of the plateau. You follow it like a compass needle, wondering if it points somewhere important. Ancient builders were no strangers to such alignments. Archaeologists have found stones that mark equinoxes, solstices, and even lunar standstills. If this one has a target, it lies beyond the ridge, somewhere you can't see, yet. The air cools quickly now, and you pull your jacket closer. The plateau is quiet except for the whisper of wind through wet grass. You imagine the stone watching the horizon the way an old lighthouse watches the sea, patient and unblinking. You're the only movement here, a small figure in the periphery of its attention. Another light joke surfaces. If you stand here long enough, maybe it will ask your name. You decide not to answer unless it offers you tea. The sun kisses the ridge, and something remarkable happens. The seam on the stone catches the last light, turning into a molten line that seems to pulse once, just once, before fading. You blink, unsure if it was real or a trick of your storm-tired eyes. The plateau offers no clarification. The moment has already dissolved into shadow. You take a few steps back, giving the monolith its space. The wind shifts again, bringing with it the smell of damp earth from the valley below. You feel as if you've been politely escorted out of a room where something private is about to happen. Behind you, the grass sighs in the breeze. Ahead, the trail back to camp is bathed in that in-between light. No longer day, not yet night. You walk slowly, matching the plateau's pace, and resist the urge to look back too often. The watcher doesn't need your witness for whatever comes next. Night has fully claimed the plateau, and the megalith stands in silhouette against a sky crowded with stars. You return to its base, guided by the silvery ribbon of moonlight spilling across the path. The air feels heavier now, as though every breath carries some trace of the stone's long memory. You stop a few paces away, letting your eyes adjust until the surface's contours begin to reappear. Grooves, seams, and faint carvings, each catching just enough light to whisper its shape. A widely accepted fact drifts through your thoughts. The repetition of certain symbols across distant cultures is one of archaeology's most persistent puzzles. Spirals, suns, and animal forms appear everywhere, from Neolithic tombs in Ireland to desert carvings in Peru. Scholars suggest these patterns may have been the universal language of early humanity, born of shared observation and survival needs. You run your fingertips along one such spiral here, worn nearly smooth. It's barely visible unless the moon hits it just right, like a secret meant only for those willing to wait. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. In the 1930s, a linguist claimed this exact pattern matched one found in ancient Anatolia. The theory was never proven, but it stirred enough excitement for a few adventurous souls to spend their lives chasing stone cousins across continents. You glance up at the sky. Directly overhead, a scattering of stars seems to echo the carving's curve. Historians still argue whether such alignments are coincidence, early astronomy, or the result of humans simply loving a good swirl. You grin at the thought. Maybe our ancestors were just as doodle-prone as anyone waiting for a meeting to end. The wind shifts, carrying a faint, dry scent from the valley below. You notice something unusual, small stones arranged in a circle a few meters away from the base, each one tipped just enough to cast a narrow shadow toward the megalith. You wonder if they're recent, placed by modern hands, or if they've been here for centuries, quietly pointing like compasses no one checks anymore. You step into the circle, half expecting a dramatic surge of energy or at least a polite welcome from the universe. Nothing happens, except that the view changes. From here, the megalith and the moon align perfectly, the light spilling down the stone's face like a frozen waterfall. You chuckle softly. Maybe this is the old world version of a perfectly framed selfie. Somewhere behind you, an owl calls, low and deliberate, as though counting the seconds between each note. The sound hangs in the air, weaving itself into the quiet. You can't shake the feeling that this place has its own tempo, one that stretches far beyond the boundaries of human patience. You kneel to inspect the base again. The soil here is darker, richer, almost as if it's been fed something for centuries. Farmers in nearby valleys have long told stories of gifted earth from the high plateau brought down to improve their fields. They never say how the soil got its vitality, only that it's different and always has been. You rest your hand against the stone one last time tonight. It's cooler now, and the texture under your palm feels less like rock and more like the skin of something that has been alive for too long to remember what it was before. A light joke tries to sneak in. If the megalith could yawn, it probably would right about now. You step back, letting it rest, even though you suspect it's never really asleep. Above, the stars hold their positions unmoving to the human eye. Below, the plateau breathes in the slow rhythm of stone and wind. You turn toward the trail that will lead you away for the night, but even as you walk, the image stays with you, a silent sentinel carrying 1,000 unspoken messages across millennia. Dawn finds you already moving, your steps tuned to the plateau's breathing. The night's cool has not yet burned away, and the stone wears a faint bloom of dew, beads like tiny planets clinging to a gravity all their own. You stop just short of your chalk marks from yesterday. The wind is barely a rumor. The sky is that pale, merciful blue that makes you think the day and you might get along. You close the last distance without ceremony, placing your palm flat to the face like you're finishing a sentence. Cold sinks into your skin. It is the same stone, of course, and yet after storms and stars it feels newly awake, as if weather has an eraser and a pencil and uses both freely. You listen for the seam's voice. Silence. Good. Some mornings even rocks decline interviews. You step back until the entire height fits in your field of view. Here is what you know, the part that behaves. The shadow falls farther north now than when you first measured. The compass says the big faces flirt with cardinal directions. The recess amplifies sound when the wind is playful. A mainstream fact steadies your thoughts. You cannot radiocarbon date stone, only the contexts around it, charcoal in a trench, a buried hearth, pollen layers pinned in mud. That's how places like Europe's megalithic rings were anchored in time, and how the startling age of Göbekli Tepe's carved pillars, late Pleistocene to early Holocene, was argued from soils and bones rather than rock itself. Stones don't volunteer birthdays. The earth keeps their calendar in the margins. You walk a slow circle and narrate, to yourself, to the watcher, to whoever tuned this hill for weather and patience. Maybe you were always here, you say under your breath, and hands only persuaded your edges. Or maybe not. The slope behind the crown looks like a scar. You consider the physics of moving too much weight with not enough equipment and realize that enough may be the wrong unit. People plus time plus purpose can be heavy machinery. At the north edge, you find last night's circle of small stones again. Dew darkens them, each points a slender shadow at the monolith like a dozen polite index fingers. You step into the ring, and the light does its quiet trick. The face brightens a fraction. The seam briefly becomes a blade, and you feel for a blink like the scene is staged just for this hour. It probably isn't, but your inner stagehand takes notes anyway. You smile at yourself. Of course, the sun is the lighting designer. You kneel, palm on the soil inside the ring. It's cool, fine, almost oily with life, as if the storm left a surplus in small pockets. You pinch a bit and let it fall back through your fingers. The grains catch the light like a slow spark. A swallow skims your shoulder with the precision of a thought. You decide the bird knows this place better than you do and doesn't feel the need to explain. A lilt of humor rises, uninvited but welcome. If there were admission here, the ticket would just say, "Patience," and admit one at a time. You picture a booth staffed by a very bored condor. Exact change only. You try one last experiment. Not with chalk or compass, but with posture. You stand where the seam's acoustics once answered you and breathe in for 4, out for 4. The way tired travelers have done since lungs were invented. Your shoulders drop. The monolith's shadow shortens perceptibly, shaving seconds from itself like a careful barber. Time is working. You can see it with your eyes. It's the only proof you really trust. A fringe-flavored tidbit sidles up through memory. Dowsers claim to feel earth lines thrumming at stones like this, a grid of energies that ancient builders learned to read with bones, water, and will. You have no rods in your hands and no verdict in your pocket. You only have your own small instrument panel, ears, skin, balance, and they report what they always report up here. Thin air, steady wind, ground that talks quietly if you stand still. Historians still argue whether alignments and echoes encode deliberate knowledge, or if our meaning-hungry brains sketch constellations on any sky generous with points. You take the long side again and hunt for that polished panel the rain revealed. There it is, satiny, faint as a memory, reflecting the low sun in a smear. You lay your cheek to it and say thank you in a voice meant for close company. The stone does not accept or refuse, it persists. There is a lesson in that which you can almost hold without squeezing too hard. Permanence here is a practice, not a property. Edges are maintained by weather. Joints are defended by fit. Stories are guarded by people who have reasons to return. Your notebook is heavy now with lines that will never be a paper. You draw a box around the phrases you like best. Watcher, thunder, road, seam, breath. It isn't scholarship, it's a map of conversation points. You have met stones before and will again, but this one insisted on new verbs. It asked you to measure without insisting you conclude. It allowed you to listen without promising to speak. You sit in the lee where the storm spared your spine and eat the last of the bread you brought. Crumbs tumble into the grass, and an ant arrives with an agenda and two friends. You watch them wrestle a flake the size of their optimism toward an impossible slope and feel, not for the first time, a kinship you didn't ask for. If they build a monument for this breakfast, it will be a grain glued to a blade of grass. You consider funding the project. Below the edge, the river blinks in sun, unbothered by philosophy. The village smoke draws straight lines for the first time in days. The willow at the base has caught a scrap of cloud on its higher twigs and wears it like a shawl. The plateau is not trying to be dramatic. It doesn't need to. You stand at last in the one place you've been avoiding, the dead center of the widest face, far enough back that the stone gets to be huge again. Your arms hang loose, your jaw unclenches. If you were a worshiper, this is where you'd raise your hands. If you were a surveyor, this is where you'd sink a stake and write numbers no one will read for 100 years. If you were a traveler, you are. This is where you memorize the outline so well you can draw it blind later in a city that smells like buses in summer. You ask a final question simple enough that it might reach. Will you be here when my questions forget my name? You already know the answer, and it isn't words. The light moves on the face by a thumb's width. Somewhere a dog in the village decides noon is worth an announcement. A cloud leans on the ridge and changes its mind. Yes, says the day, on behalf of the rock. Yes, within the terms we both understand. You walk to the chalk marks one more time and thumb them into smudges. The trail out waits, unbothered. You put the notebook away. You shoulder the pack that has achieved the density of a medium comet. And you give the stone the courtesy it has earned. No grand farewell, no bargain for secrets, just a parting that assumes you may return. You leave at the pace you arrived, boot after boot, the plateau shrinking by degrees that do not feel like loss. The monolith keeps its place in your peripheral vision a little longer than physics strictly requires, then yields to hill and sky. It has given you a working definition of wonder you can carry. A thing that resists you just enough to make you softer. You do not look back. You do not need to. The watcher has a better memory than you, and if stones keep attendance, you are now a quiet tick on a very long roll. Let the climb fade behind your knees, and let your breath slow to the kind of rhythm that turns minutes into smooth water. Picture the plateau from above, its wide, calm table, the thin braid of a path, the lone silhouette holding the morning like a cup. The wind has already filed its paperwork and gone home for the day. The grass has folded itself neatly. The stone is doing what it always does, being here exactly. Let your shoulders grow lighter, as if someone quietly set down the pack you forgot you were carrying. The last chill of dawn slides out of your sleeves. The sun's warmth settles gently along your back. Imagine the seam's low note now softened to a memory, hovering at the edge of hearing the way a familiar lullaby does when a room gets quiet. There is nothing to fix. There is nothing to keep up with. There is only the slow tilt of light across an old face. Somewhere below, the river turns lazily and decides to keep its appointment. The willow uncurls another thin leaf. A swallow writes a brief sentence on the air and dots it with a bright wing. If you stand still long enough, even thoughts learn to arrive without knocking. Let them. Let them come in soft shoes, look once at the view and find their own seats. Now let the stone's outline dissolve a little. Edges rounding, weight becoming gentler, presence staying while sharpness ebbs. The ground under you remembers every foot that has stood here and offers the same even welcome. Rest if you like, walk if you must. The sky closes the page as kindly as it opened it. Breathe in, slow and easy. Breathe out even slower. Whatever the watcher knows, it keeps in trust. You only need the quiet part, the part you can take with you like a smooth pebble in a pocket, unnoticed until your fingers find it and calm down. The end, sweet dreams.